Hello, welcome to the online video training program by Prevention Works, formerly known as CASIC.
Today's training is on electronic nicotine delivery systems. Hello, my name is Ken Dahlgren, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Tobacco-Free Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and Allegheny County through Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. This is a program funded by the New York State Department of Health. I've been in tobacco control for nearly 20 years now and am a prevention specialist and certified tobacco treatment specialist. I received my MPH and my bachelor's in education degrees and frequently present on subjects like nicotine addiction, electronic cigarettes and vaping, and tobacco industry, also on advocacy and tobacco and social issues like tobacco and poverty and tobacco and human rights.
Hello, I am Trish Whetstone, and I'm the Prevention Education Coordinator here at Prevention Works out of our South County office. I got my Bachelor of Science degree with a minor in Public Health from SUNY Fredonia, and I've been working with Prevention Works ever since as an educator. I do have some professional trainings under my belt on various drug topics, including current drug trends, marijuana, e-cigarettes, which we'll be talking about today, and you may have listened to some of my other online trainings on stress management or marijuana and adolescent brain development. We will start our focus today really looking at nicotine and its implications on brain development and addiction. Then we're going to transition into looking at the different types of electronic nicotine delivery systems, what these devices are and what they might look like. We're going to look at different marketing techniques that these companies have used over the years and aspects of this new vaping subculture that we have seen as vaping devices have become more popular. And lastly, we will of course be discussing some risks associated with using these products.
Before we get started, we would like to emphasize a few important things. One, that vaping is a controversial topic. We know that there are strong feelings on both sides of the issue. Even amongst tobacco control professionals, there's some discussion about pros and cons of vaping. Our purpose is not to debate the effectiveness of vaping as an adult cessation tool. That is something that still has to be determined by government agencies. It is currently not an approved cessation device, but someday maybe it will. We're also going to be focusing on the role of nicotine in addiction because that's an important aspect for us to understand the role that nicotine plays. We will also give a basic overview of vaping and the disturbing trends that we're seeing amongst young people. This is probably the most important issue, that vaping has become an epidemic amongst our young people. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, e-cigarettes have the potential to benefit adult current smokers who are not pregnant if used as a complete substitute for regular cigarettes and other smoked tobacco products. E-cigarettes are not safe for youth, young adults, pregnant women, or adults who do not currently use tobacco products. While e-cigarettes have the potential to benefit some people and to harm others, scientists still have a lot to learn about whether e-cigarettes are effective for quitting smoking. If you have never smoked or used any form of tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, don't start. And this especially applies to our young people.
So one of the most common questions that I get from kids when I'm teaching in the classrooms is, Miss Trish, why do they even make cigarettes if they're so bad for you? And the short answer is, of course, money. And we talk about the fact that these companies don't necessarily care about the health of young people. They really are just out to make money, and they really specifically see young people's brains as dollar signs because of their potential to develop an addiction, which we will get into. Now, then I flip the question onto e-cigarettes and I say, all of a sudden, are these same companies wanting to make people safer and healthier and have a better alternative, or do they have the same intention? They have the same exact intention. They're still out to make money. The invention of the e-cigarette and these companies really saw this as a huge business opportunity to play off of the age of electronics and market to and hook an entirely new generation of nicotine users with these more modern, innovative products that really just don't seem as gross as a traditional cigarette. So we see companies such as British American Tobacco making their own e-cigarette brands, such as the Views and Blue, and we have recently seen companies such as Altria and Philip Morris invest in the most popular brands such as JUUL. They recently purchased 35% of JUUL because this product is one of the ones that is actually the most popular among young people.
We have been noticing a very disturbing trend amongst current tobacco product use in U.S. high school students over the last several years. If you look at this slide, you'll notice that in 2011, the cigarette use rate of conventional cigarettes amongst high school students is listed at 15.8%. Vaping or e-cigarettes was listed at 1.5%. And the reason for that is that's right about the time that vaping actually was introduced as a mainstream product here in the US from China. And so not too many students had discovered it yet. You'll notice over the next 3 or 4 years, the tobacco use rate continued to drop fairly dramatically, actually, until 2014. But notice what's happened with the vaping and the e-cigarette use rate. It's far surpassed the conventional cigarette rate and continued to peak until 2015. And I believe around that time, students started to become more aware of some of the issues around vaping. They realized it wasn't just harmless water vapor. Prevention education and prevention educators were able to let them know some of the risks, and they started to learn more about what are some of the issues around vaping. So, the rates started to drop a little bit, and the rates of conventional cigarettes, continued to drop, but not as dramatically. We really believe vaping helped to, in some ways, sustain those tobacco use rates amongst conventional cigarettes as well. By 2016, a new product appeared on the horizon, and that was the JUUL product by the JUUL company, which consisted of pods of nicotine salts, which were easier on the throat. They came in some wildly delicious flavors that young people really enjoyed. And the popularity of JUUL took off dramatically to the point where, as a company just introduced in 2016, by the time 2018 and 2019 came along, some folks actually say they now have 75% of the e-cigarette market. That's how fast JUUL rose in popularity. And you can see that reflected by 2018 with a 20.8% rate amongst high school students in the United States, whereas the tobacco rate was 8.1% amongst conventional use of cigarettes. What's especially disturbing is that 8.1% was the first uptick that we'd seen in many years of the conventional cigarette rate, from 7.6% to 8.1% in 1 year. We believe that may be due to the fact that some of the young people who use vaping products, who start with vaping products, who started with no intention of ever using conventional cigarettes, have transitioned on to start using conventional cigarettes. Some of the studies show that they are actually 4 times more likely to do that. Now, for comparison, let's look at the rates amongst youth use in New York State. And you'll notice that it's very similar to what we saw with the use rates for the country as a whole. This chart is especially helpful in that it takes us back to 2000, right about the time that New York State developed a comprehensive tobacco control program. And you'll notice that when we started, the actual rate of cigarette use was close to 30%. It was 27.1%, and actually over 30% of any tobacco product use amongst high school students, 33.6. So 1 in 3 use some form of a tobacco product. That has steadily declined to the point where actually our low in conventional cigarette use was in 2016 a 4.3%. That's an amazing decline due to the efforts of many people who spent a lot of time educating and making people aware of the dangers around conventional tobacco. But while this was happening, we had a new epidemic emerging on the horizon, and that was vaping and the use of e-cigarettes amongst young people. You notice that New York State didn't start tracking that trend until 2014. And at that point, vaping already was more popular amongst high school students in New York than the use of conventional tobacco. The rate was, slightly higher. E-cigarettes were 10.5% compared to 7.3% of high school students using conventional tobacco. But then now what's happened in the next 4 years is that e-cigarette use is now 27.4%, and regular cigarette use is 4.8%. But again, we see the very disturbing trend that we saw at the national level, where that use of conventional cigarettes has gone up a half a percentage point from 2 years before, 4.3 up to 4.8. Again, the first real uptick we've seen in 18 years of monitoring this. So again, that's a very concerning trend and one that we really need to pay attention to.
So as Ken was saying, we have really seen in recent years a huge shift or a huge increase in the amount of youth who use e-cigarettes. That shift that he was talking about from 2014 to 2018 was a 160% increase in use. In 2014, only about 1 in 10 students using vaping devices and e-cigarettes to over a quarter of students using in 2018, almost up to 30% at that 27.4%. And we also know that increase in traditional cigarettes is a concern as well. Now, one of the things that I want to bring up is that from working with the youth directly, we know that their perception of use or perception of how many people use is actually much more than this. I've talked to many students who think that probably at least half of the kids in their grade have used e-cigarettes or at least tried a vaping device. Now, whether that 50% is true or not, we know that perception of use is really important because when kids think more kids are doing it, they're more likely to do it themselves. And we're starting to see some really drastic measures being taken at schools. For example, some students have said that it's hard for them. It's honestly a stress to even go into the bathroom because so many kids use in the bathroom and they feel like if they even have a slightly bad reputation, that they will be accused of using. And some schools are even using detectors to detect for vaping within their bathrooms. So we know that this is a huge problem from the data. We know it's a huge problem from the perception that youth see and what they're thinking. And so now we're going to get into a little bit of the science behind addiction and nicotine and the use of these products. But I hope we've emphasized that the use is really high and it has increased over the years. So we know that nicotine is really one of the most addictive substances around, if not the most addictive substance. And we know from brain science that addiction causes serious and chronic changes to the brain, resulting in a brain disease characterized by continued use despite harmful consequences. Our aim is to really educate on the consequences of use in early years in which the brain is not fully developed yet. And although this applies to all other psychoactive substances, we know this is especially true of nicotine. It is one of the first drugs that people might use or abuse, and research has shown that this can actually kind of prime the brain for addictive behavior, which is where we get that term gateway drug. For a while, we weren't able to use it, and then we were able to use it again. But essentially, what we know is true is that when someone starts with nicotine, for example, they are more likely to go on and use other substances later on. Or if they used other substances within their life, like heroin, they usually started with nicotine. And we think that's partially because of the way nicotine really affects the developing brain. So we know that the teen years are really a pivotal point in brain development. And the brain actually does not stop developing at 18 or 21, which is what a lot of people might believe, but the brain really continues to develop into the early and mid-20s. It can be all the way up to age 25, and we know some research has actually pointed that their brain might still develop all the way up to age 28. They do take a little bit longer to mature. The really important part, though, is that the last part of our brain to develop is that frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe controls our decision making, our impulse control, our judgment. But what happens around age 13 is that our reward center in our brain is actually already fully developed. So we have teenagers who are likely to participate in risky behavior and exciting experiences just for that feeling of reward, but they aren't able to really make good decisions and control their impulses. And what we also know is that young people aren't as equipped to deal with their stress. And unfortunately nowadays, we know that kids do experience a lot of stress. Stress is not just for adults. Young people do experience a lot of stress, and they aren't necessarily able to control and reason with their emotions as much as adults. So what we find that young people use drugs for the risk of it, for the excitement, maybe they use it to cope, and all those things put together with an underdeveloped frontal lobe results in more addictive behavior. And when kids are addicted, or anybody's already addicted to nicotine, they're going to need it for that reward. They might need it to manage their stress or that feeling of stress because their brain just craves nicotine, and they won't necessarily be able to make good decisions or reason really well. So what we found is that young people are more likely to then make a switch to other products that they might have seen at one point as disgusting, or they may have rejected it. For example, we see young people switching from e-cigarettes or vaping devices to using a regular combustible cigarette. So we do have research, we have some statistics to show that more people do develop addictions when they're younger. So 90% of adult smokers actually began before the age of 18. And for alcohol, we know this is even a little bit higher. 98% of alcoholism develops before the age of 18. And we know this is because of that underdeveloped frontal lobe mixed with that reward center that craves any sort of drug, really. And using these drugs underage really creates these permanent changes within the brain and sets them up, unfortunately, for addiction throughout their life. And we know this is not a minor problem. We want to stop addictions because addiction to different addictive substances is really one of the major causes of death in our country. So 450,000 people still die every year from tobacco use in the US alone. This is not the entire world. And that's equivalent to about 1,200 Americans every single day. So this is not a minor problem. We know that more people die from tobacco use than murder, AIDS, suicides, car crashes, alcohol, all other drugs put together. So just because tobacco is legal and nicotine might be more common, not seem as scary as illegal substances, we know it is still a very serious, lethal problem. So we know that the use of nicotine products is not only associated with an increased risk of nicotine addiction itself, but it's also associated with addiction of other substances. So what we see here is that people are only about 6% of people will develop alcohol use disorder if they've never been clinically diagnosed with nicotine addiction. Now, they are 3 times more likely to develop an alcohol use disorder if they do have a clinical diagnosis of nicotine addiction, or about 15.2% of people who are addicted to nicotine will also become addicted to alcohol. We see a similar trend with other drugs. So about 2% of people who don't have nicotine addiction will go on to use other drugs or will use other drugs, but about 10.9% of people who have nicotine addiction will go on to use and abuse other substances. So that is an increase that is 5 times more likely to abuse other drugs if they already are addicted to nicotine.
While we know about the role of nicotine in addiction in the body, I think sometimes we don't understand that nicotine also does have effects on the body in other ways. We've talked at length about how nicotine addiction and nicotine as a substance changes the developing brain and can rewire and cause permanent changes in the brain. That, we understand, but what we don't sometimes realize is how it can impact other parts of the body. Nicotine is a stimulant. Nicotine can cause the heart to beat faster. And while we may think, oh, being a little stimulated as a young person, sometimes that's a good thing. Gets them motivated, gets them up, gets them moving around. But that stimulation can cause negative impact on the heart, especially nicotine in somebody's body who has some cardiac problems. It can actually put that extra stress, leading to other issues. One of the things we noticed right away as a side effect when some of the early clean indoor air laws were passed in some of the cities and states that did it early on is that within a matter of months, the rates of people being admitted to the hospital for heart attacks decreased dramatically. And we we wondered about that, but then they realized that people being exposed to even nicotine through secondhand smoke in smoky bars and restaurants was actually impacting the hearts of people who maybe had some minor cardiac problems, and the nicotine exposure actually made that worse and caused more issues with heart attacks. So that was a kind of an interesting side effect we saw of some of those early bans on secondhand smoke. Nicotine also can cause inflammation in the lungs. It can cause trouble breathing. It's especially important for those that have asthma not to be taking nicotine into their body, because that can cause, some significant problems for people who have some breathing issues to begin with. But as we're starting to also see in the news, there are definitely some issues around breathing caused by vaping, which we're talking about, and we don't know if nicotine plays a role in that or not. It's still being studied. Another thing that nicotine has been proven to be a part of is increased problems with acid reflux and some digestive issues. So some people who are using heavy doses of nicotine will notice more and more upsets and more issues around acid reflux. So these are just some important things to recognize, that nicotine not only plays a physical role in addiction, but nicotine can also impact the body in other ways, in a negative way.
So the first electronic nicotine delivery systems were actually really developed a few decades ago, but never really popularized or put into use until they were really invented by a Chinese man to help his father quit smoking. So it was really a good intention. They were developed but as a cessation device, but when they were introduced in the United States, they were popularized, bought out by big tobacco companies, and we saw the entire shift change to really just recruiting more people to use nicotine and tobacco. These products are a little bit different because they allow users to inhale a nicotine-laced aerosol product. It's a little bit different than tobacco smoke, but we're going to go into all these different components here. So what they do is they aerosolize nicotine laced with propylene glycol or glycerin and all sorts of other chemicals. And essentially, these products are not yet regulated. So we see all sorts of chemical components that are definitely risky for our health, have not yet been regulated or really approved to be used. And also, these products, the amount of nicotine can be really variable within them because there's no quality control over local vape shops. So we found that when they're studied and researched, that nicotine within these products are a lot higher than they sometimes disclose. They might say that they have no nicotine, but they have a couple of milligrams of nicotine. Again, trying to just fool people and trick people into kind of getting addicted to their products. The FDA has had a couple of chances to regulate them, but they really are not regulated. So using these products is kind of almost technically equivalent to using a black market product. There's no regulation over what needs to be put in these e-juices, on exactly how much nicotine or any caps on nicotine levels. And this really poses the biggest risk, because anybody who uses these are just putting themselves at risks. We can't necessarily know exactly what is in their singular device. Another huge point that we want to make is that there is this whole subculture surrounding vaping. So users don't smoke, they don't see themselves as smokers or users of tobacco products even. They vape. And vape has actually become a actual word within the dictionary. And the next video that we're going to show is just a little clip of some of these vaping competitions. So we see that drug use has actually kind of become a sport, a way of life, a different culture, a lifestyle that people are adapting. So it's much more than just using the product, it's this whole entire culture that is surrounding the product. So this is a traditional electronic cigarette or cig-alike, but any electronic nicotine delivery system will essentially have three different components. One will be a battery or a power source. Usually it's a rechargeable battery, oftentimes lithium-ion batteries. Then there's some sort of heating element, and basically this mechanism works by heating up a liquid, or sometimes in the JUULs, a nicotine salt, a solid, into a vapor or a mist. And this is essentially how these products work, but because of this system, they actually pose some additional risks that we didn't necessarily see with traditional cigarettes. So for one, batteries can corrode. If we think about when we leave a battery lying around in an old flashlight, they can corrode and cause toxic chemicals to be released. We've also found that those batteries can heat up and there's a risk for explosion. We know cigarettes cause fires, but they probably won't explode in your face. And also the heating elements are usually metal coils, and that can actually get into that nicotine mist and get into the vapor and be ingested into the body. So we have seen high levels of lead and tin, just to name a few heavy metals that have been found in users, and that absolutely poses a health risk. One additional thing is that those heating elements, those coils, oftentimes, many of them are still produced and purchased from Chinese companies. So there is that issue of quality control. We can't necessarily know exactly if those elements are perfectly safe or safely made.
In this slide, we can see some of the more common vaping devices. If we start all the way on the left, we have the very early ones that were introduced and still are in use today. The cig-alikes, because they were designed to actually look like a traditional cigarette. That's what was first introduced. So those first couple are cig-alikes. And then we go over and we see a little bit of an evolution of refillable vape pens, and sometimes called e-hookah pens or vape pens. The early cig-alikes were generally had closed cartridges, and they weren't refillable. A lot of them even weren't rechargeable. They were disposable. Some were rechargeable. Then as we get into the vape pens, especially you see the fourth one over with the yellow, you can see the clear yellowish area where the liquid can be put, and that can be refillable. And they can be modified in various ways. Temperature, they can use a higher temperature. The solutions can be changed for, say, those that are into vaping competitions. They can regulate the temperature and the composition so that they may get more smoke. And then you get into some of the mods, and these are devices that many times are homemade or are made at vape shops. They're custom made and much more easily able to be tailored towards individual needs and higher temperatures, um, and basically are customized to what people would like to have in their device. You also can see that there are some vaping devices that are designed to look like traditional cigars and traditional pipes. But again, they all go back to the type of device that Trish talked about, and they all have the same common components. Um, some of the refillable devices oftentimes will have a wick in them that can deliver the juice from the cartridge to the heating area. The wick introduces it into the heating area so it can then be vaporized. Part of the problem with some of the bigger mods, like the one you see in the middle, is the fact that they lack some safety devices, and it is easy for them to be wired in a way where maybe a dangerous amount of current can come into the device. The problem with the higher amounts of current and the hotter the vape juice is heated, you end up with more toxic chemicals being released, such as at the highest levels, the levels of formaldehyde can be quite high being emitted from these devices. So there is increased risk there. This slide shows the evolution of e-cigarette devices from the very first disposable e-cigarettes, which really were a first generation type of device, then on to the second generation where you could get pre-filled pods and you could change out the pods. You didn't have to throw away the whole device, but just simply the pods. And then onto the third generation, which are refillable tanks or mods. And I talked about some of the dangers already of being able to have the higher voltage, which of course can lead to increased number of toxic chemicals being released. And then onto the fourth generation, which are really back to a pod style again. But the big difference here is the nicotine that is used in these pod mods are based on a nicotine salt, which are actually smoother going down, smoother on the throat. They actually give a much more traditional tobacco type of experience. Early e-cigarettes actually were not very popular with traditional tobacco smokers at first because it felt different. It tasted different. It was a different type of experience and it required some adjustment. The new pod mods, especially the JUUL devices and then related devices that use the nicotine salts, they found out actually helped to duplicate the traditional tobacco experience a little bit better. And that's obviously why they become so much more popular than traditional tobacco or e-cigarette devices now, taking up about 3/4 of the market and displacing some of these other types of earlier devices. We've talked about JUUL several times. We've brought it up, we've mentioned it, but let's discuss it just a little bit more so we have a better understanding of what the JUUL device is. The JUUL product, that's a brand name. It's a company name. It was a company that was developed to create these pod style nicotine delivery devices. And they claim to have developed them to help adult smokers stop smoking and give them an alternative. Unfortunately, it appears like they've taken the playbook from traditional tobacco when it comes to marketing to young people. And it's been shown in recent testimony before Congress that they actually studied some of the tobacco documents, the early tobacco documents, and looked at how did traditional tobacco market to young people. And then they did some of the exact same stuff. So you'll notice advertising for JUUL products on television. Well, a lot of people think, oh, well, it's not legal to advertise for tobacco on television. Well, no, it hasn't been. But unfortunately, vaping devices weren't developed at the time the legislation came along, and juuling and other vaping products are not covered by that. So technically, they can advertise on television. But you'll notice the advertising is changing, and partially because they've gotten in a lot of trouble with Congress and with the FDA over the fact that it becomes very apparent that they are targeting their advertising towards young people. So that has had to change. Um, JUUL has actually become its own verb. Juuling is now a thing. It's actually a real thing. It's a new word in our dictionary. JUUL nicotine liquid refills are called pods. And the device that they plug into is generally pretty small. It looks a lot like a flash drive or jump drive or whatever you would want to call it. There's a number of different names, but it actually can recharge by plugging into the side of your computer. And especially in the early days before teachers recognized what was going on, kids were charging their JUUL devices in class, and the teachers thought they were simply flash drives. In fact, that's still happening today. Um, JUUL has been available in several different flavors, cucumber flavor, fruit flavors, mango flavors, and mint flavors. And that has been especially critical in young people adopting the habit is that the flavors are appealing to them. It's something that they want to try. It smells good. It tastes good even to them. One important thing that when young people were surveyed about JUUL products, 2/3 of them actually believe that there's no nicotine in JUUL products. And the worst part about it is not only is there nicotine in JUUL products, every JUUL pod up to this point has nicotine. And the level of the nicotine, according to the manufacturer, this is not anti-tobacco folks coming up with this. This is the actual makers of JUUL who are proud of the fact that one JUUL pod contains as much nicotine as a pack of 20 regular cigarettes. And actually, when scientists have analyzed it, it actually comes out to a little more than that. So at least the equivalent to a pack of regular cigarettes. And when JUUL became available in the United States in 2015, it started taking off rather rapidly. Within 2 years, it became the top selling e-cigarette brand in the United States, and now it has far surpassed anything else. Even with the investigations and even with the crackdowns from government agencies on trying to figure out JUUL's role in the vaping epidemic around young people, they're still popular. Um, Widespread use of JUUL in schools, classrooms, in bathrooms, and as Trish has already talked about, many schools are starting to take some very drastic measures to deal with this, including detectors and trying to develop education programs and other programs to deal with those that are caught using JUUL during the school day. So it has definitely created quite a challenge for people working in prevention to be able to counter some of the misunderstandings about JUUL. The fact that it doesn't have nicotine when it really does, and the fact that it delivers so much and is so popular with our young people. There are some young people that actually are smoking 3, 4, 5 JUUL pods a day, we're finding as we're talking to them. And to me, that is an awful lot of nicotine going into a young body. And, it's a very dangerous situation to be in.
Here we just see a few examples of merchandise that has really been created surrounding the popularity of vaping, and it's really this whole entire market that has skyrocketed and taken off because vaping has become so popular. And these products are concerning for a couple reasons. One, they're actually used to help you conceal your vapes, kind of hide them or link them, and they're models that kids can use to then learn how to conceal their vape. So sometimes we are finding that kids are actually purchasing these products, but oftentimes they're just using this as a model and then carving out those little strings on their hoodie to bring their vape into school, vape in class, breathe in some vapor and exhale it into their hoodie so that you don't even see the vapor. There's all sorts of YouTube videos and blog posts where you can learn so much about how to conceal your vape and the whole culture surrounding it. A lot of products actually promote multiple drug use. We can see the one on the right, it's a koozie for your beer, and you can vape at the same time, and it's convenient because it's hands-free and you could still play sports or do whatever it is that you want. So they make them look cool, convenient, promote drug use, kind of promoting drug use wherever, right? What we kind of saw when vaping first started is that people were vaping anywhere, in schools, in restaurants, around their kids, because it was seen as safer, not nearly as bad or kind of um, didn't have a negative connotation like traditional smoking. And another thing about these products is that they have all sorts of cool gadgets. Like there's even some products that can have like Bluetooth in them so you can play music while you're doing it. So we know this is definitely promoting use in youth and young people because it makes vaping really just a cool lifestyle. There's so many things like this surrounding vaping that are appealing to kids, not necessarily just using the drug itself or just using it. It's really all this merchandise and this marketing that goes into making vaping a subcultural lifestyle.
Let's talk about flavors because flavors are a very important issue when we're talking about vaping e-cigarettes, especially in youth use of these products because flavors are very appealing to youth. They are popular with some adults as well, but when you think about young people and you think about some of the flavors that are out there, like Smurf's blood or gummy worms or Swedish fish or cotton candy, those are definitely flavors that are not being marketed to somebody's 85-year-old grandmother. That they are generally flavors that youth find very appealing. Now, flavors can come in pre-filled cartridges, or they can come in do-it-yourself refillable bottles. And one of the issues we run into is the fact that there are kids out there who have been very open to telling us that they mix up flavors for their friends in the back of their car, in their trunk. They've got their little setup and they'll mix up custom flavors. When you think about it, the number of flavors that can be done are unlimited. Um, and one of the things that I became very aware of recently when talking to some of the scientists at Roswell Park who are actually analyzing the chemical composition of these flavors is flavors can vary and do vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. One company's strawberry flavor may consist of 200 different chemicals that are put together to create this artificial strawberry flavor, whereas the next company may have a mixture of 150 chemicals, and many of those are different from the other company. So there's really unlimited number of chemicals that can be brought together in any given vaping liquid. And some of these chemicals are, it's important to understand that when they are vaporized, they turn into other chemicals. So where you may start out with 200 different chemicals, a cocktail of them coming together to create this flavor, those chemicals are then vaporized and turned into thousands of other chemicals, which are then inhaled into the lungs. How in the world can we understand the effect of each and every one of those chemicals on the human body at this point in time? We just don't know. They are being studied, and there have been some chemicals that have been identified as causing some issues, lung inflammation, and other sorts of lung disease. But the science is still young. So that's why it's especially important to protect our young people from the potential epidemic of disease. And, we're starting to see that come forth in the news and with the number of deaths and the number of people that have become ill as a result of vaping. Now, the vaping industry likes to say, well, that's just due to black market stuff. But as Trish has said, technically none of our vaping liquids are regulated at this point. We have no way of knowing exactly what's in any given cartridge or any given bottle of liquid until these things actually do come under regulation by the Food and Drug Administration. So it's important to recognize that there are thousands of flavors out there. There's, I believe, the last figure I heard, there's at least 9,000 identified flavors that have been documented. And of course, as I said earlier, the number of potential flavors is unlimited. It's just a matter of putting together a new chemical cocktail for each flavor, and there, there you're good to go. You can create, the newest trend. Um, some people use traditional tobacco flavor. That tends to be more of an adult thing. There's been a lot of attention put on flavors recently. In fact, bills being proposed in New York State to ban flavors, and the governor actually trying to ban e-cigarette flavors, vaping juice flavors, which unfortunately right now has been held up in the courts. That could change. Maybe at the time you're viewing this, who knows? But there are new regulations coming forth to try to regulate that. But what's important to recognize is if those new regulations don't include a ban on menthol or mint flavors, they really will be very ineffective, because what the studies have found is when the fruity flavors are not available, the kids are buying the menthol and the mint, and it's not really decreasing the sales. So as long as menthol and mint are allowed as a legitimate flavor on the market, the kids will turn to that if they have to, if they can't get their mango or they can't get their cherry or whatever it is they're used to. So those are some issues around flavor. Obviously there's going to be a lot more in the news. Keep tuned, listen to the news, become aware of what's happening in New York State and in other parts of the country. And even at the federal level, there are attempts to regulate flavor. We've even heard indications from our president that that's something that he would like to see happen. So let's pay attention to that. But just know that while flavors are available, flavors can be a very dangerous component of the e-liquid. And it's important to recognize that just because it says strawberry doesn't mean it's natural, doesn't mean it's safe. It could be some fairly dangerous chemicals to inhale into the human body.
So, an important thing to note about nicotine is that it's a stimulant drug, it increases our heart rate and blood pressure. But besides that, it is also a very strong toxic poison. So, there have actually been deaths around the world for decades from young kids who are handling tobacco leaves within the field, and it's actually absorbing through the skin that way. So, nicotine can absorb through the skin, it doesn't even have to be somebody smoking it. And this is also true for liquid nicotine. People who are using these devices and they have their e-juice lying around, that can be spilt on hands and absorbed through the skin that way. But when we've actually seen poisons, it is from ingestion. And from the visual we just saw on the last slide, we see that there's not a big skull and crossbones on this bottle, just like we don't see that with alcohol, even though that's technically a poison for young children. These bottles have gummy worms on them, they have tutti frutti, they look like a candy or a juice. And so young children have actually been accidentally ingesting them, not understanding what it really is, because people are leaving their e-juice around. And we've seen calls to the Poison Control Center skyrocket over the years. And this is very, very important that there have actually been a couple of deaths from these devices and these juices as well. So we've seen these poisonings because liquid nicotine is extracted directly from the tobacco leaves. So the nicotine that's in these e-juices is pretty pure. And in really high doses, liquid nicotine can actually kill an adult. It's not just poisonings that we've seen in young children. It's really very risky and poisonous for absolutely anybody. But that ingestion of e-juice is what has killed young children. And we see these calls to the Poison Control Center averages about 3,000 to 4,000 per year, which is a lot, regardless of whether those are deaths. Even calls to the Poison Control Center where children have toxic amounts of nicotine in their system is very concerning. And just in 2019 alone, we saw the data back in May that it was already 1,722 poisonings. So this is not something that is going away. It is a continuous problem. And part of this is just because there's that lack of disclosure on the ingredients. These e-juices, because they're not regulated, don't necessarily have to disclose how much nicotine there is. Some say they contain no nicotine and they've had amounts of nicotine in them. Some of them actually have more nicotine than they disclose. So regardless, there is just that lack of disclosure. We don't know exactly what is in there, and we know that these flavorings, like Ken touched on quite a bit, have toxic chemicals. Over 100 toxic chemicals can be added to these flavored e-juices. So flavorings are not necessarily safer. Some of these chemicals have actually been shown to be carcinogenic, and we're going to break down these chemicals in the next slide.
So what is really in that e-cigarette aerosol that you're breathing so nicely into your lungs, and what our children are breathing? Well, that e-cigarette aerosol contains many harmful and potentially harmful chemicals and substances, some of which we don't even know the long-term effects yet. But what we do know is, as I've mentioned before, those flavorings that are added um, do break down and do turn into other chemicals and other substances when they're vaporized, and some of them have been shown to be cancer-causing substances. We've talked earlier about the fact that the heating device in the vaping device is containing metal, and when that metal is heated and when it vaporizes the liquid, it also allows small particles of that metal to break off, and little tiny microfine particles of nickel, tin, lead. Those are common things that have been found in vaping aerosol. There are other volatile organic compounds that are released. And of course, we've talked about nicotine itself as not being a harmless chemical in your body, and some of the things that nicotine itself can do. One of the other things that I really like to stress, especially to young people when we're talking about what comes from e-cigarette aerosol, is just plain ultrafine particles. When anything is combusted, there are tiny little inert particles that may not be cancer causing in any way, shape, or form. But what happens to those tiny little particles is when you breathe it in, they go into your lungs and they go into the tiny little air sacs in your lungs and they don't leave. And over time, you accumulate these tiny ultrafine particles, and they actually have been shown to get into the bloodstream. They can impact the linings of your blood vessels. They can impact your entire respiratory system. So it's important to understand that even if something is totally inert and not a cancer causing chemical, it can still lead to issues with lung problems and developing other respiratory and cardiac issues. And these ultrafine particles have also been shown to play a factor, in strokes and heart attacks. So that's important to remember. You get those same ultrafine particles off from traditional tobacco as you get coming from vaporizing the liquid from your vaping device. Now, we've mentioned flavoring in general. Just for one example, um, some of the flavoring that's like fruity, especially lemony type of flavors, and some of the citrusy flavors, actually diacetyl, which is a chemical that's been used to create one of those chemicals to create those flavors, is the chemical that has been used in the past to create the buttery flavor in microwave popcorn. And they discovered that people working in microwave popcorn factories who were exposed to levels of diacetyl frequently developed a serious lung disease called popcorn lung. So it's important to recognize that that same diacetyl that has been shown to cause this very serious lung disease is also present in some of the flavors. And that's just one example of how a flavor has been shown to impact the respiratory system. There are, as we've said, thousands of other things that are being breathed into the body when a person vapes. So it's very important and sometimes difficult for consumers to know what e-cigarette products contain. There's been a lot of misinformation out there, and it's important to remember that what we do know is concerning. What we don't know is even more concerning. Generally, when we talk about tobacco use, we talk about cancer. But I think it's important to recognize that with conventional tobacco use, lung cancer is 29% of the death toll. The rest of it is due to other things like heart disease, pulmonary disease, stroke, some other cancers, and other diagnoses. So, of the 480,000 US deaths attributable each year to cigarette smoking, now this includes the figure we talked about before, plus those due to secondhand smoke. That's where we come up with the 480,000. That 29% of that is lung cancer. Well, so how does vaping enter into this equation? Well, it's very possible that vaping may lead to less lung cancer and maybe to less other cancers than traditional tobacco. Again, the jury is still out. We don't know that 100% certain, but let's say it was. I still would have a very difficult time, based on the evidence we're seeing, to believe that there's going to be significantly less heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and stroke, and other issues like that. That those figures would be a lot less for vaping. I would find that difficult based on the evidence we're seeing. So how does vaping impact these diseases? Well, we're not 100% certain, but we're starting to get clues. We're already identifying the lung issues, but we're still learning.
So we're seeing vaping devices being advertised in ways that aren't necessarily true and aren't necessarily conducive to getting to people to use less. So, for example, they're advertised like they're an effective smoking cessation device. We can see from this photo that they're actually within the smoking cessation section next to the nicotine patches and gum. And as Ken already stated, there is just not enough research showing that it's actually an effective cessation device. Maybe one day, but what we're finding right now is that most people are just switching to e-cigarettes or vaping devices and getting hooked on nicotine that way. They're not necessarily kicking their addiction. And if people are, they're more of the exception rather than the rule. They're also using the same successful strategies that we saw tobacco use years ago, and they're using those same exact strategies again. Kind of this ad is playing off of that popular Marlboro man with that sense of freedom and kind of that cool looking cowboy, or just advertising these in the same ways that we saw traditional cigarettes being advertised. We can see the same thing with images like this with the use of sex appeal. That has always been a common strategy to get people to use tobacco products and substances in general. We're seeing it with that idea of innovation, and that it's really all about futuristic principles, and that it's new and it's modern. And they used to say that about things like cigarettes, and that's absolutely the same strategies that they're using with vaping devices now. So they can say all day that they're maybe not necessarily advertising or thinking of these products in the same way that they thought about tobacco, but we're seeing from the advertisements and the way that they're being pushed out into the general public that it's very similar to what traditional tobacco did. And we can also see that in some ways they're not even advertising it as a sensation device. It's really an alternative, right? The old ad, why quit smoking? Just smoke true, because this is maybe a better or healthier cigarette. It's a better alternative because it maybe has lower nicotine. And we know that's not necessarily true. The same goes for e-cigarettes. This advertisement is showing that they're not even trying to flaunt it as a sensation device, but saying instead, this is your better alternative. We still want your money. We still want you to use our products. We're just going to try and fool you into thinking that this product is better. Lastly, we have that alternative bandwagon that, we want to kind of disregard establishment and the control and bans on smoking. And we could see that with old tobacco products like chewing tobacco, that maybe it wasn't quite as taboo as smoking, that you could still use tobacco inside the office, maybe if you were to chew. And that's absolutely what happened when electronic cigarettes came out, that there's a smoking ban. Maybe you can't smoke your cigarettes around and outside, But we absolutely want you to use your electronics everywhere. It kind of gives you that sense of freedom that you can use your product and it's not going to be as taboo or as frowned upon.
Another very important issue around vaping, especially when it comes to the use of our young people in vaping, is the fact that vapes aren't just for e-juice anymore. They may have started out for e-juice and as a nicotine delivery device, but obviously it didn't take very long before people realized it could be used with other things, with synthetic drugs, with THC, the active ingredient, psychogenic ingredient of marijuana, and heroin and fentanyl and meth, opiates, anything that can be put into a liquid concentrate can be used in a vaping device. We've even found many information sites available on the internet, videos that show how to actually do some of these things, how to infuse your vaping liquid with heroin, how to use other substances. And it's right out there for people to find. And our young people are looking at these videos and they're trying these things. And there are vaping devices that have been specifically made to be used with some of these alternative products. It's not just a matter of adapting nicotine delivery devices, but actual devices that are marketed this way. Some that can be used with dried marijuana, some that can be used with wax substances, with hash oil. Many different new products coming onto the market. Marijuana concentrate can actually be up to a 98% THC concentration. Can you imagine that? And then putting that into some kind of a liquid or a wax that can then be vaporized. The amount of substance that a person can inhale into their body. And there are specific brands on the market, as I've mentioned. I'm not going to mention them by name, but they're out there, and you can see some of them listed on this slide. Here you can see some images of some of those actual devices, and I think it's important to show you these because you may be seeing some of these around your home and not recognize them for what they are. It's important to know what our young people are able to buy off the internet and are able to obtain and to use. So now this brings us to today, to what's happening really right before our eyes. This slide shows, some of the news clips about vaping and how vaping has been in the news recently, and about some folks that are becoming extremely ill, and even a number of deaths that have happened across the country due to vaping. New York State has had more than its share of these vaping-related illnesses and vaping related deaths. And it's important to recognize the fact that New York State and the CDC have been studying this. And you've probably perhaps heard in the news recently that, oh, we can blame this all on black market e-cig products that are using THC, and that vitamin E acetate is the reason why these people are getting sick and dying. And while that has shown to be true in a majority of the cases, it has not been shown to be true in all the cases. And that's why New York State came out with a new statement on November 8th of 2019. That's, right close to the date that we're recording this video. And that statement, they caution that they greatly urge all New York State residents, young people, old people, everybody, to not start using vaping products, and if they are, to stop using vaping products, because we cannot say that just vaping products that only use nicotine, even products without flavor, are safe, because the evidence does not support that at this point in time. So I think that's important, that until we know 100% for sure what the risks really are, and will we ever know that? That's a big thing to actually know. But the good news is, in some ways, it has caused vaping products to be scrutinized very, very carefully by both the federal government and New York State. New York State has actually been leading the way in our testing labs in Albany to test these products and to find out really what is going on with these lung diseases. But as you can see from the advisory, it's not just a matter of the lung diseases, but there still have been concerns about the explosions and the people who have suffered severe burns as a result of vaping, some that have suffered from shrapnel from exploding devices. Um, it's not a safe thing. And even before these vaping related lung illnesses were highlighted, we've had stories for the last couple of years about isolated cases of a wet lung disease and other types of lung diseases that have only been shown in um, those that are vaping. Had the recent opportunity at a conference to listen to the story of a young man who related his experience of getting addicted to JUUL devices at the age of 16 and how it basically controlled his life. He was vaping so much it changed his personality, his nicotine addiction. He was an honor student who dropped out of everything and was failing. And then he started consuming so much nicotine that he started having seizures and it affected his heart and he had to be hospitalized. And then after his hospitalization, he had to go into drug rehab to get over his nicotine addiction. And this is a young man, not even 18 years old. So I think in light of everything we're hearing and seeing, it's important to keep aware and to not only keep aware of what's happening in the news, but keep aware of what's happening with the young people who are in our lives and be able to get information to them in a timely way and help prevent them from becoming addicted to a substance that can harm them and could harm them for the rest of their lives.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Just to review, we talked about the dangers of nicotine and its implications on adolescent brain development and addiction. We looked at different types of e-cigarettes and vaping devices, or ENs. We looked at how they're marketed and the different aspects of vaping subculture that really go beyond just the health implications. But of course, we also talked in depth about some of the risks associated with using, what we know and what we just don't know. And like Ken said, what we don't know is almost more scary. So thank you so much for joining us again. And please remember, if you need any sort of credentialing as CPP or KSAC, you'll need to take the short quiz after this. And you can also take a look at some of our references to learn even more if you so choose. Have a great day.